Okay, we are in Esther, in chapter 8, specifically of Esther. If you want to wander over there and join me. We just finished taking a look last week at the first couple of verses of chapter 8. So just a very quick review. Our main characters are Esther, who is married to King Ahasuerus, who is the king of Persia. She is a Jewess. Her cousin Mordecai has helped to set her up and give her advice. Mordecai also won't bow down to a guy named Haman, who hates Mordecai and the Jews because of that, wants to wipe them all out. Esther contrives a plot basically to inform the king about this and to have Haman killed in the process. Haman has been executed, and now Mordecai has been given command or given charge over the house of Haman. Technically it was given to Esther by the king, and then she put Mordecai in charge of that. And the king has elevated Haman to the position, or sorry, has elevated Mordecai to the position that Haman held, which is basically second in command. As I think Ken pointed out last week, there's a lot of parallels here to the story of Joseph in terms of the relationship with the Pharaoh and his rank in the kingdom. So Mordecai has ascended to that position, and so we've resolved some of the problems here because we've gotten rid of Haman, and the king is now favorably disposed towards Esther, and Mordecai is now in charge of Haman's household. But what's the big issue that's still unresolved?
Killing the Jews.
Okay, we've still got a command room from the king that authorizes people throughout the Persian Empire to kill the Jews wherever they can find them and steal their stuff. And it even basically offers them a bounty for having done that. Ken?
I have a lawyer question for you.
Okay.
Why did they have this thing where a king could issue a decree, but then he could not go back and change it later? Do you have any idea historically why that's?
I don't have it. There's not any real historical clarity. If I was guessing, it would be because that would eliminate the possibility of someone. Well, okay, so two things. One is it eliminates the possibility of somebody falsely sending out information and trying to overturn the king's position. The other one, and I think probably the more significant one, is that it creates continuity of government in a way that, for example, we lack in this country. I'm not kidding. Think about it. So one of the reasons we can't get Congress to do anything difficult is because they know that if they do something difficult, they're going to get kicked out of office, and immediately the next Congress that comes in is going to undo whatever they did. So what possible incentive is there to ever do anything that actually requires you to actually have some guts?
Title 42.
Okay, well, whatever it is, I mean, when it comes to immigration law more generally, what possible reason is there to ever do anything that would be dangerous or risky when you know that that's going to lead to you losing your position? And on top of that, I mean, you might be willing to accept doing it if it was going to work and that you were going to lose your position because of dedication to the public interest. But when you know that the very next thing that's going to happen is that the next Congress is going to come in and undo it because that's why you got kicked out, why would you possibly do anything?
In my ESV study Bible, it says it can't be revoked, and then it cross-references to Daniel 6:8. And it says, "Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians."
Right.
Which cannot be revoked.
And that's, I mean, and that's the law. Ken's question is, why is that the law? And like I said, I suspect that latter one may be the most important one, because if you're the king, you don't want the next king to come along and undo whatever you did if you thought it was important enough to do it. And not everything is done with this king's signet where it's the unbreakable kinds of things. Most of the commands that would have been given would not have been under the king's signet. We'll see here in a minute. There's a reference made to it. When it's under the king's signet, that's when it can't be changed. So maybe that's the issue, is we want things that are irrevocable. Haman wanted this to be irrevocable, obviously, because he felt so strongly about it, and of course Mordecai and Esther wanted to be because of similar reasons. So.
Well, and I was going to say, maybe when they did it that way, then nobody could come in and just assassinate them and undo the law.
Exactly. I mean, well, that goes to that continuity thing. You know,
yeah.
It is, if you have things that once you do them, they can't be undone, then you don't have to worry about that thing being the base, trying to change that thing, be the basis for which you might be deposed, or you might have people fighting against you or something like that. Let me get Steve and then Jerry.
Well, and this is only speculation on my part, when a leader that is considered so sovereign, even worshipped in many cultures, to redo something is to admit a mistake, and that is, would say, well, yeah. I thought you were way above.
You were a god. Gods are not supposed to make mistakes.
You don't make mistakes, and so to admit that, oh, this was wrong, would be.
That's a good point. I hadn't really thought about that, but that's true. When you're talking about, maybe, I mean, the pharaohs actually were believed to be gods. The Persian kings, maybe not quite that close, but sort of like demigods, you know, they were like almost gods. So, you know, yeah, and even if you go into much more modern times, when you have the kings who had the, like Louis the 14th, that had that, what was it called, the divine right kind of a thing. There was that idea that they're inspired by God. So even if you're inspired by God, it's problematic if you're having to go back and change your mind.
It shows weakness.
Right. It's one of the criticisms that people have leveled over the centuries at the popes, as well as the prophets of the LDS group, is that if you're inspired by God, why do you have to keep changing things? You know, shouldn't it be right, you know, consistently? So yeah, I can see that would definitely be an issue. You want to make sure that there is that weight to what you say, so that people take it seriously. Now, it does raise an interesting question. What if you do make a mistake, and we're going to see the hoop should jump through to get that solved? But Jerry, go ahead.
I was just thinking about the same situation in Hezekiah and Ezra's time, whenever they are rebuilding Jerusalem, and their question, and the question is sent back to Babylon, and they have to research multi-years to find what they're looking for.
Right.
But once it's found, it's not changed.
Right.
And they implement it. It's implemented.
Yeah.
It's been said. So there's some value to the long term of
Right.
that when they do it properly, I guess. I mean, that's the good side of it.
And I think that's the continuity of government thing that I was talking about. And one of the things you see when you look at it is a weakness of democracy. There's no getting around it. It's a weakness of democracy that was identified at the very beginning of this republic by, who was it? Alexis de Tocqueville, who pointed out that the ability of the American democracy depends on people, he didn't say it this way, but essentially consistently doing the right thing over time without coming to recognize the ability to rapidly manipulate and alter the government. And like I said, I'm really paraphrasing it. He didn't say anything like that, but that's essentially the observation he made, is that the weakness of democracy is that it's very, very fluid. That's a strength as well, because it's much more able to adapt to the situations that it encounters, and it is much more able to rebound when something bad happens. But when you compare democracy to long-term long-term dictatorships, for example, continuity of government in a dictatorship is far superior in general, unless you've got a lot of assassination issues. But if you're going to guard against assassination, continuity of government in a dictatorship type of system is much more consistent than it is in democracies. When you look at, for example, China or the Soviet Union under the
SARS.
not the czars actually, but under the communists, in both cases they would come up with 5, 10, 15-year plans to execute. And they did. Now, they usually turned out horribly because they were based on completely bad economic principles. And it's not to their credit that they continued to pursue them past the point when it was obviously a failure. But it is to their credit that they were able to do that in the sense of they have the continuity of government to do that. And that is one of the advantages that you give up in democracy. And as the character of your people begins to degrade, the ability of the democracy to do important things that will last for long terms becomes more and more problematic.
That adaptation or ability to adapt to changing situations, changing information, is what I was thinking about. Because you spent some time there. I spent my whole career in the electronics industry. If we try to lock something in and never change it, you go out of business in a hurry.
Right.
So I'm just used to a much more fluid, developing, evolving, changing, progressive environment. And I think government should try to follow in the same way. So,
and I mean,
ultimately, you end up with the bad side is the two examples you mentioned of Russia and China. And continuity was there, but it was continuity of a horrible thing.
Right.
And so, you look at it both ways.
Yeah, and there are hypotheticals about something in between where you have there have been actually benign dictatorships that have actually had the interests of the people at heart in general, tended to be pretty flexible. It's the ones that tend to be very totalitarian, that are not interested in the good of the people, that tend to be really inflexible. And so there may be, this is not intended to be a political science class, but just in general, my observation is that democracy is not perfect and maybe the best system we have, but the fact that it is imperfect suggests that we should continue to think about ways we can improve it. But that is, when you do talk about continuity of government, the ability to pass a law and to know that it's going to be carried out and that nothing is going to overrule it, it's not going to change down the road, does create a sense of stability that cannot exist in the absence of that kind of a rule. So,
To bring it out of the realm of social sciences exclusively, that's the interesting thing and the dichotomy for us as Christians to wrestle with in our democracy. We are in a kingdom spiritually, and we have a leader whose word cannot be changed and
Right.
will not be changed. Even down to the smallest jot and tittle, it says it's not going to change. And it's a very good thing because obviously God ultimately does have our best interests at heart. And sometimes it doesn't look that way. And that's the same thing that was going on with Esther and Mordecai and the king.
right.
It didn't look like that was the best way to go for the Jews, and it probably wasn't. But in the case of God, even when it doesn't look the best, that's where faith and trust come in. We have to believe, like Paul said, he causes all things not to be good, but to work for our ultimate good if we believe and trust and obey.
Right. And I think it's interesting to borrow a part of what you were talking about. It's interesting to look at the way that the gospel and the new covenant is structured as opposed to the old covenant. The old covenant is much more like what we're talking about here, that hard and fast rules designed to operate within a specific context, which is a theocratic-based society of a self-governing theocratic society. And it became problematic, whether it was when they were in captivity or once the Romans took over, it became problematic because to greater or lesser extents, it limited their ability to follow the laws and the rules. And of course, after the Roman destruction of Jerusalem and the ultimate scattering of the Jews, it became impossible for them to follow some of those rules, such as the temple sacrifices. The new law, the new covenant, is, I think, structured in a way that's designed to make it operate and be able to operate in any environment. You don't have to be in a godly country to have a godly church. You don't have to have a theocratic government. In fact, I would say theocratic government is almost the worst thing in the world for the church, because every time it's happened, it's made things way worse. You don't have to be, you don't need specific structures. You don't have to be able to. The church doesn't have to be able to own property and to worship publicly to be able to function. We know that from the first century. We know that even today in many countries that Christianity illegal. So Christianity is now designed to operate in a way that is completely flexible from the standpoint of what's going on around it. Now that doesn't mean it's completely flexible in terms of what the expectations of Christian believers are, but in terms of the flexibility with regard to the environment that you're in. I mean, when you get right down to it, the only things you really need to practice as a Christian is some water, access to bread, and to some kind of, grape-related drink. And you pretty much got everything you need to be able to function and to follow the first century models. Everything else is just practical applications in the world environment in which you live, So the flexibility there, and I think that speaks to the foresight of God, that he is operating on a different level, and there's that continuity of government within the kingdom, certainly in terms of his recognition that Judaism was designed only for the Jews. I mean, over and over in the scriptures it says that. We're so used to being a proselytizing religion, we don't think about it in those terms. But Judaism was designed to be for the Jews, and if you really, really wanted to be a Jew, you could do it, but it was really kind of a pain. It was never designed to go beyond that. At most, they were designed to be a light to the nations to show what God's people should look like. If you're going to create a religion that's a proselytizing religion that's supposed to go to all men in every nation, you can't make it limited like that. It has to be much more adaptable. And I think one of the interesting things about many of the other proselytizing religions is that they just aren't. The Islam, for example, requires, to be functional, it really requires some things that are difficult to achieve in a country like ours, and that's one of the reasons why so many Islamists, I'm not talking about all Islamic people, but the ones who are determined to convert the world, feel like you have to change the culture before Islam really is going to function in that society. Christians want to change the culture because we believe it's better for the culture, but we don't feel like we need it to be a certain way for us to be able to operate. So there's a lot of fluidity in Christianity that doesn't exist in Judaism that I think is very necessary for it to work the way it does. And that speaks to God's wisdom in doing that. So, okay. Anything else on this? We've kind of taken a wide diversion, which I find fascinating because I love political science. But all right, so let's go ahead and talk about how we undo the unbreakable commands. So, somebody read for me verses 3 through, let's see, 3 through 8, chapter 8 of Esther.
Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king. And she said, "If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked."
Okay, so first things first, it appears that this does not happen immediately after the events of the chapter that we've just looked at. That there's a sequence here. There's the initial where Haman is executed, there's the dinner and Haman is executed, and then the king at some point shortly thereafter gives the house of Haman to Esther, and Esther appoints Mordecai over it. These are things that would take a little bit of time. And then at some point in the short time after that, she goes and appears before the king again. Why do I think that that's true, that she's gone and appeared before the king again?
Because he has to hold out the scepter.
Okay, so he's holding out the scepter. Now it is possible that what's happening there is that she's already in his presence and he's holding out the scepter more to tell her that he's receptive to what she's asking for. And that's a possibility, but it is more likely that she did go in front of him uncalled for again and was relying on the golden scepter to be the solution to that problem.
Do you remember the timeline of like when Haman went to the banquets versus the month they were supposed to do the destruction?
It's not clear. We only know there's 30 days that passes between when the announcement is made and Esther finds out about it, because Mordecai goes into mourning for 30 days. And then there's a short time with the banquets. But yeah, because there's 11 months. It's the decree is issued the first month, and it's supposed to take place the same day of the 12th month. So it's likely that, this isn't, there's an urgency, obviously, and you need to communicate this stuff quickly, but it's not as though every single decision has to be made the night that Haman is executed in order for everything to get done in time.
Right, and this perhaps shows Queen Esther's wisdom in stepping back. Now, how do we fix this problem?
Right. And so there's a second stage to this whole process. And again, the orders need to go out in time, but it doesn't have to be, like I said, the very same day. You've got several months, as long as you're not, procrastinating unnecessarily. And this is sort of the sort of thing you would not tend to procrastinate too much about when your entire, race of people is going to be annihilated. So Esther goes back before the king. She falls down. He extends the golden scepter. My guess is the second time she went before him wasn't nearly as nerve-wracking as the first time, because it worked out well the first time, and he's clearly on her side at this point. And so she goes there, and she asks him to revoke the letters devised by Haman. Now, what's the problem? We've been talking about this already. What's the problem with revoking the letters?
Okay. Well, anything sealed with the king's signet ring can't be revoked.
Okay, and Haman did have it sealed with the king's signet ring. So we can't revoke what he did, but the king points out, what does he say his feelings towards Haman are? What did he say he just done to Haman? He's kind of conveying how he feels about everything that Haman did.
I think he totally believes that Haman was wrong, because Haman has already been executed for his actions, and I don't think he knows what to do, so I think he's gonna end up letting Mordecai figure it out.
Okay?
But I'm not sure he doesn't have a suggestion.
It's
He also says, I've given all of Haman's stuff to Esther,
Right.
and he's been hanged over.
Right. So I think what he's saying there is, I have put an end to Haman and his side of things. So now you have control of everything he had control of, and he was the guy who was paying for the bribes for people, or the bounty for the Jews. He was the one who'd sent out the commands in the first place. So he's basically, I think, saying, you have all the authority you need to solve this problem, and I'm okay with you using it however you want to solve the problem.
Right as you please.
Yeah. Mark, what were you going to?
I was gonna say too, maybe it was something to do with the signet ring, because he's taken it off of, dead, Haman.
Haman.
And so, and maybe it's something that he misused this signet ring, he misused his,
Yeah.
And so I'm giving it to Mordecai to fix this. Now, you can use the signet ring to fix this. And maybe that's part of it, because at the very start of this whole thing, when Haman did all this, he said, let me do this.
Yeah.
Because I'll
Yeah.
take care of it for you. And it's kind of went around him, and then he uses because he has the signet ring, to go ahead and do this. And I'm wondering if that finally, it kicked in on the king, like, uh-oh, I let this guy get a little bit too much power.
Yeah. I think part of the reason when Esther first reveals to the king that he's, what this plot and everything, the reason that he goes outside is not only because he's angry that Esther's being threatened, but because of that recognition, or at least while he's out there, the recognition dawns on him that he gave the wrong guy the keys to the kingdom. He put the wrong guy in charge. And so there's certainly an extent to which taking the signet ring away from him is a very symbolic act of saying, okay, you've abused this, I'm giving it to somebody else instead. It's interesting that he chose to do that with Mordecai as opposed to keeping it himself, which some people might have done out of a fear of ever making the same mistake again. But once Mordecai has the ring, he is now in a position to do anything that under the king's name that he wants to. So I've got multiple hands here. Let me go with Linda first.
But he still can't revoke it.
Right,
So
that's the thing.
He's giving him the authority to come up with another counter edict.
Right.
To deal
A
with it.
solution that doesn't overrule the previous solution, yes.
I have a comment, but based on your comment, I want to make this observation that, yeah, he's picked Mordecai, and Mordecai has already demonstrated his trustworthiness in saving the king's
Yes.
life, which the king just happened to discover.
Just that same day, or
Right.
just,
A
yeah.
little bit before that. This is a side note, but it's an interesting insight into the culture and into the way that they negotiated and the way that they had conversations, and it reinforces what you've said all along about the literary quality of this book. We see things like Abraham and some of the negotiations he gets into to buy the cave of Machpelah, for example. But look at how Esther presents herself. Fourfold: if I please the king, if I have found favor in his sight, if the same thing seems right before the king, and if I am pleasing in his
Yeah.
sight, in his eyes. So it's very flowery and very very humble. I can't talk this morning. It's flowery, it's humble, and yet it really presents a good opening for what she's
Right.
requesting and explaining her tears.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that is something, it is very much a Middle Eastern kind of way of speaking, and it is interesting that she says, essentially she's saying the same thing 4 times, except maybe arguably making the statement about the matter seeming proper to the king is a little bit different. But essentially she's saying the same thing, but she's putting it before the king. And I think a big key to this is, throughout this, she is asking the king for permission. The king is saying, you can, once she makes the request, he's saying, hey, he's got the ring, he's got the power, he can do it. But rather than simply going and doing something without the king's permission or without him understanding what they're asking for, Esther first asks, and that helps to avoid repeating what Haman had done in terms of abusing the king's permission and the king's authority. So, Steve?
Well, if this is written according to actual quotes that Esther made, it brings to my mind that she's a pretty clever person. Not just to add to what was said about how she present, if it pleases you, if you find favor in me. Because, then she's using that as a real tool for the king. But in the same words surrounding all of that, she calls what happened an evil scheme, a plot. These are letters that are devised by this Agagite.
Right.
Okay, so she's calling him not even one of us. So I don't know what an Agagite is, but apparently it was something that she used to say, he's not even from here.
Right, that's his group, just like she was a Jew.
Right,
He's an
and he
Agagite.
comes in, and so he got you to do something that was evil and all of that. So she really sets the king up for what she wants him to do, which is to give permission to do something about it.
Right. And she also says in verse 6, how can I endure to see the calamity which will befall my people, and how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? There's two things that I think are very clever about that. The first one is she's personalizing it. And it's much harder for the king, I think, probably to deal with it or to disagree, because when it's personal than if it was just kind of a general thing. But also she's forestalling the argument that the king might make conceivably, which is, I'm going to protect you. Don't worry, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to take care of Mordecai. He's his second in command. There's no danger to you, so don't worry about it. She's saying, I'm still worried about it. These are still my people. This is still going to be a huge blow to me if this goes forward. So there's no risk of the king coming back and trying to argue that she's protected. She's making this about her, but through her she's making this about all of the Israelites. And so that's, I think, a fairly significant argument or powerful point to make there, to make sure that the whole thing is personalized, but it's also broadly applicable to all of the Jews. Sorry, I had a thought here I wanted to add.
Agag
Yeah.
was one of the early kings of the Amalekites.
Okay, so he's an Amalekite.
Probably an Amalekite.
Okay. Which would make sense because that was part of the Persian Empire by that time too. So, okay, so, and it's interesting because the Amalekites were, historically bitter enemies of the Jews as well, and that's Haman's background there would have tied right into that. So, so the king, Esther has actually asked. This is what I was going to say. She actually had asked the king to revoke the letters devised by Haman. The king's response, well, it doesn't directly say I can't. It's written in a way that makes clear that that's the one thing that can't be done, and that instead he's empowering her and Mordecai to do the next best thing, which is to come up with a new set of orders that will essentially countermand or counter-effect those orders. And so he says in there, a decree that's written in the king's name cannot be revoked. But when he says that, he's saying it to her more as a reassurance than he is as a statement about why he can't do what she wants. Because he says that in the context of, you and Mordecai write some new orders, sign them, seal them under the signet ring, and send them out, and those orders can't be revoked either. The either's not in there, but essentially that's what he's saying. So the important concept is conveyed, I can't simply revoke them, but I can give you the power to do whatever you want to fix the situation. And essentially what we're going to see is that the solution that Mordecai and Esther come up with is better than the one that Haman did in terms of the power that it creates for the Jews and in terms of the outcome. And so by sort of stacking one edict on top of another, you can essentially overrule a previous edict without ever having to revoke it. And I think that's the one thing, and that's sort of the irony of the whole continuity of government argument that I was making, is that the limitation of that is that if you could come up with another order and find another way around it, you can make the same thing happen. It's just as well you might have revoked, So it's an interesting system, and in some ways it kind of fits with the Persian formality mindset just in general. As many Middle Eastern people are and were, the Persians are big fans of formality and formality in how you speak, formality in how you do things. the notion of not being able to go back and revoke a previous order makes total sense out of that mindset, because it's like, this just gives me another opportunity to come up with some new flowery way to do something else, you know? And so it's just, and when you think about the power of kings, in a way that it even benefits them, because this just gives them one more opportunity to come up with another order that they've issued that makes them look impressive and important. So anyway, it all kind of works out. All right, let's go on. Somebody read for me verses 9 through, let's see. Let's go 9 through, I think it's just, wow. 9 through 10, I think, is all.
So the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month, that is the month of Sivan. I don't know if that's the right pronunciation. On the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews and the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces, which extended from India to Cush or Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to every province according to its script, and to every people according to their language, as well as to the Jews according to their script and their language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by couriers on horses, riding on steeds, sired by the royal stud.
Okay, let's jump there. So first of all, the reason I was confused is because that is a really long sentence. Verse 10 is a really, really long sentence if you actually look at it. It goes, I mean, it goes quite a long ways there.
Well, it is in the comment in the ESV.
That's true, so it's even longer. We're not done yet, we've got even more. So there's a lot of interesting things here to me. So this is setting up what the orders actually say, and I don't think we're going to go to those till next week. Kind of depends, but I find it interesting because what is done here is done with, I mean, maximum royal trappings, kind of a thing. I mean, in every possible way, you know. It's from the, you know, the scribes are coming in, so it's not just Mordecai like writing something out himself. The scribes come in, he's dictating the commands to them, and instantly this answers the question you were asking earlier about when it happened.
Yeah.
So basically about 2 months have gone by from the point that the initial edict went out. So it took about 2 months for this whole thing to be worked out. So Mordecai sends it out, and then it talks about who's it sent to, who's it written to. Well, the Jews, the satraps, local officials, governors, princes of the province, all of the people who are in charge, basically. And it goes to say everywhere. So it's just in case you weren't sure, it's going everywhere, from Ethiopia to India, 127 provinces, every province according to its script. So it's nobody can misunderstand it. It's in the right language, it's in the right script, it's official. So you've probably got multiple scribes there, in part because they're writing it down in each of the different languages that they're sending it out in. So it's going out everywhere, as well as to the Jews according to their script and language, so everybody can understand this. He writes in the name of the king. He seals with the king's signet ring, and this is my favorite part. He sends it by a courier on horses riding on steeds sired by the royal stud. So even the horses are official horses, like they're the king's, you know, the king's horses, basically. So
the ESV, the only version that says swift horses.
let me see.
Mine says who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king's service.
This mine just says on horses riding on steeds, so it doesn't talk about the way. Although actually it has a note that actually does say, I think. No, it doesn't. I'll take that back. That's not that note. The terminology here, it kind of sounds repetitive. So I'm wondering if maybe it didn't translate this fast because otherwise it's repeating the same thing twice and maybe understood it that way. I don't know. But anyway, the horses are riding. The horses are steeds. They are signed by the royal stud or bred for the king's service, whatever you want to say. But again, these are official horses, official written documents, official king's seal, official couriers riding on official horses. It's like you can't possibly fail to understand that this is what the king wants to have done, you know, and just kind of almost overdoing it on one level at least. So the whole thing is kind of a big production. Why is it being made such a big production? Or do you have another comment first?
No, I have a question. What's a satrap?
It's just it's a provincial governor, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's just a different word for it, but basically they're
I've never seen it
local.
before, yeah.
They're local, more local officials, so.
Since they come through here every year, I can't help but see the connection. This was the King's Pony Express.
There you go. Yes, basically, that's true, yeah. So it is a very official kind of thing. So why are they making it so official? Why is Mordecai, or why are they going out of their way to make this so official?
Well, the last communication that they had was kill the Jews. They might not even know that Haman's dead.
Okay? It's good at
So we
that.
need to make sure that everyone knows that this is what's the new thing happening.
Okay, so they need to communicate to everybody, and Linda, did you have
Well,
thoughts?
especially the Jews too, so they
Okay.
knew everywhere what they were gonna be able to do or
Right.
have to do.
Right. And I think in terms of the fanfare that goes along with it, the official nature of it, you want to make sure that no one can try to argue that this isn't legitimate, that this isn't really, especially since even though you're not technically overruling or revoking the previous one, the orders that you're giving directly affect this previous order that was given. You want to make sure that everybody understands that this is the new order of things, so to speak, and that this is a legitimate order with the full weight of the government behind it. So you want to make sure that it's taken seriously. So there's no risk that somebody might say, you know, we're not going to follow that one, we're going to follow the old one or something like that. So, okay, we're going to read to the end of read the order. We won't talk about it too much right now, but somebody read for me verses 11 through 14 now.
Saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. On one day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, a copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province, in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them.
Okay. So it's interesting that we have a listing here of the different banquets. Remember, this is the next of our banquets, the feast that the Jews hold. This one becomes significant, though. Anybody know what this particular feast turns into? Purim, that's correct. And so, yeah, so it's created, it becomes a Jewish holiday going forward from this. The Purim part relates to the word pure. I'm forgetting why that comes out of this particular story. I don't even remember.
That's the name of the lots that are killed.
That's right.
They're locked.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So, in any event, the feast, they have feasts and all the other stuff here. So let's see, we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. So, the basically the additional edict does what? What is the core principle of the new edict that's been sent?
Got a question and an answer.
Okay.
So the answer, it gives them the right to fight back,
Okay.
first of all. My question is, why wouldn't they just fight back?
In the first place, why would
Why
they do
did
that?
you need an edict, right?
So that's an interesting question. And I think what it comes down to is, in the original edict, it was the order to destroy them and that you could get money for destroying them and stuff like that. There's nothing inherently that would say you can't fight back, but when it's a government order to do it, on the face of it at least, it would seem like if you did fight back, you would be violating the king's order, because the king's order doesn't say you can go fight against them, it says you can go kill them. So the argument I would probably make is that if the Jews had fought back under the original order, what would have happened is that the king's forces would have joined in or would have been ordered to continue the process of
So,
slaughter.
and then I guess just talking about it, it's almost like a show of power in a way,
Kind of.
right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, this edict was made by kind of by a bad guy, but now the king's backing the Jews, And so anyone attacking them is going to feel his wrath along with.
And we're going to see that's exactly what happens as we get into chapter 9.
That makes sense.
Not this week, but next week. Linda?
Well, I think the Jews were a dispersed people. They may not have been considered citizens, and they may not have had rights to like that.
That, I mean, and that, I think that's more broadly true. Kind of, you know, it's hard to fully understand the circumstances here, and we don't really have an entirely clear picture of it. But yeah, there are. Certainly we know under the Romans that the Jews were not citizens by and large, and so they had lesser rights, and even most Roman citizens, or most Roman people weren't citizens. And so there was a greater rights according to different groups of people. But yeah, there's a real possibility that they didn't necessarily have the right to do that, or at least not on a mass scale, that a single individual who was being attacked might have the right to defend themselves. But that given that there was an order from the king that they could go do this, the Jews would not have been in a position, and they also wouldn't necessarily have been in a position to be effective in that regard. In terms of if large groups of people massed against them and came after them, because they were dispersed, they might not have been really well served to try to defend themselves successfully anyway. So in this case, though, it turns it around and it gives them the right to, it says, and this is a kind of important part, it says to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them. The word army there is an interesting word because it actually means something more than just army. It means assembly, or it's a broader context. And the reason that that becomes significant is when it says the right to the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women. What it's talking about there is that it gives them the authority. Basically what it's saying is, if you attack the Jews and you lose, it's not just you that's going to lose, it's your families are going to die too, because the Jews can respond by wiping out everybody that's related to you. This is actually, today this is a very uncommon thing. In the past, this was actually a very common thing. You want to discourage people from doing something really bad, don't just threaten them, threaten their families. The Soviets were actually very good at that. The US had a lot of trouble with terrorism, and so did Western Europe for a long time during the Cold War. Soviet unions had almost no trouble with terrorism, and the reason was because in the West, if you committed an act of terrorism, you were arrested and you were jailed, but they didn't do anything besides that because they couldn't. In the Soviet Union, the first time a bunch of Soviet diplomats were kidnapped by terrorists, the Soviets kidnapped the families of the terrorists and sent pieces of them to the terrorists until they let the families out. And that was the last time anybody ever kidnapped a Soviet diplomat because they knew what was going to happen. So when you raise the stakes like this and say now you can go after anybody's family who comes after these Jews, it totally changes the equation in terms of what you're willing to do.
I think there's a philosophical situation going on as well. The people that had the order to kill the Jews now know that they're going to have opposition.
Absolutely.
And it also gives time for the Jews to gain a little confidence in themselves that they are going to be able to defend themselves, and probably did some organizing and to come up with plans on how they were going to do it and and equipment to do it. Whatever pitchforks or whatever they were using. But they had to, I'm sure there was a greater opportunity for them to defend themselves.
Yes, once they knew that they were able to do it, it was legal and everything. Yeah.
And they had the king's blessing.
Yes. Ken, did you have a thought?
One final contrast. In the first 15, Mordecai leaves, having issued the command, all his great robes and splendor, and the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. Now I want to compare that with what was said when Haman, let me find the right book, when Haman issued the edict to destroy the Jews at the end of chapter 3, the king and Haman sat down to drink. The city of Susa was thrown into confusion. Which is a glorious contrast between God's way of fixing things and Haman's way of trying to destroy things.
Well, it's interesting because it suggests that when the order was issued by Haman, that the majority of the people in Susa who knew Jews were going, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
And when the second order comes out, the majority of the people in Susa are going, yeah, this totally makes sense, because these are good people, And so I think but it's a great point. I'd forgotten the contrast there, but that's a really good point. Okay, we're going to take a break for 10 minutes or 15 minutes until we have our worship. Thank you guys for your participation, and we're done.